Hello everyone! For today's video, I wanted to talk about Japanese because I haven't done it in a long time, I think. And so I came up with this video idea of talking about things that I would do differently in Japanese if I were to start over again. Just a bit of context, my level in Japanese is by no means advanced. I'm still pretty much flirting with the N4 level. A2 level, if you're not familiar. I thought it would be interesting to sort of think about what I would do differently to be more efficient and sort of save time and, learn from my mistakes, if you will. And hopefully that's something you'll find interesting as well. Dare I say inspirational, hopefully. I try to make my videos as interesting and useful as possible. So, if it helps someone, then I'm happy. And without further ado, let's get started. The first thing that comes to mind in terms of what I would do differently is I think I would build a small but consistent vocabulary system much earlier and more consistently. That's the key word. Because when I started learning Japanese, I did study vocabulary, but it wasn't very consistent. For example, when I was using Japanese for Busy People, the textbook, I downloaded the Anki deck with the vocab from the textbook and I studied them for a while. But the problem is that once I was done with the deck, I would take long breaks. And so basically I would study vocabulary for a couple of months and then stop. And when you stop reviewing regularly, you forget a lot of what you learned. So in a way, a big part of the time I spent learning vocabulary ended up being a bit redundant. If I had to start again, I would focus much earlier on building a small but consistent vocabulary routine. Potentially, I would have jumped straight into 6K decks, meaning the most 6,000 common words, or if I felt like there was a bit too much of a task, something like 1K or 2K decks, and then make sure that I never sort of quit doing them daily, basically. The advantage of 1K or 2K decks is that they might feel more manageable, because 6K sounds a bit intense, let's be honest. But the important thing is not so much intensity, but rather consistency over time. Even learning a few words a day adds up a lot after a few months. That's pretty much the concept developed in the book The Compound Effect, where small actions repeated over time create much bigger results. I recommend this book, it's quite interesting. The second thing I would do differently, I believe, is I would use tools like ChatGPT to practice grammar, vocabulary, and ask questions. When I started learning Japanese, most of my grammar and vocab learning came from textbooks. I would read the explanations, do the exercises. Sometimes I would watch YouTube videos about specific grammar points to have something a bit more comprehensive. And occasionally, as I said in the first part, I would download Anki decks and learn the vocab of the textbook for each lesson and chapter. And this way of learning is definitely, good, I think, to get started with the language and, getting to grips with the basics. But the problem is that everything makes sense until you try to make your own sentence and suddenly you know nothing. Jon Snow. If I were to sum it up, I would say that the main limitation is that they are not interactive ways of learning. So if you have a very specific question, or if you want to try making your own sentences using the new grammar and vocab you've learned, there's no one there to respond to you or give you feedback to check you're doing it right. So you might understand the grammar in theory and kind of understand the vocab, but you don't necessarily get many opportunities to actually use them or test your understanding outside your textbook. So if I started again today, I would definitely use something like ChatGPT much more to practice grammar and reinforce vocab. For example, I would ask it to give me small writing prompts, checking sentences that I wrote, asking follow-up questions when something isn't clear, or even practicing sentences with new words. By the way, this is something I've talked about in my previous video, which I will link below. And of course, you could also do that with a tutor because, they did exist before ChatGPT, right? But essentially what I would say is that it's important to have something interactive when you're learning a language, somewhere where you can ask questions and try using the grammar and vocabulary instead of just, reading about them. Third, I would set clearer short-term goals. When I started learning Japanese, I did have some structure in the sense that I would work through textbooks and try to finish them, which I did. I went through a couple of textbooks, but even though I had that structure, I didn't always feel like I knew exactly where I was going. I did have the long-term goal of becoming fluent, which is obviously a huge and very distant goal. Not exactly something you can schedule for Tuesday afternoon, am I right? But looking back, I think it would have been much more helpful to break that down into smaller short-term goals. For example, things like learning 2K words, mastering a specific list of grammar patterns, learn 100 kanji by the end of the month, or reaching a certain level like N4 in a year, with specific steps to get there. And when you do that, suddenly becoming fluent starts looking like a plan instead of, wishful thinking. And finally, one thing I would also do differently is spend more time identifying what my actual weaknesses were. Early on, I wasn't really trying to analyze where I was struggling. I was mostly just studying Japanese in a general way, going through textbooks, learning vocab, and studying grammar. It was kind of like free-flowing, essentially. And part of the reason for that is that I didn't always have much feedback on my Japanese, which kind of ties into what I said before. And without feedback, it's much harder, I think, to notice the specific areas where you're having trouble. Another reason, which I obviously kind of mentioned before, is that I didn't really set clear short-term goals for myself. I think part of me avoided doing that because I felt like setting goals would add too much pressure and I kind of just wanted to chill. But looking back, I think a little bit of constraint can actually be helpful. Not something intense or stressful because, let's chill, guys. But just some small goals that would give my studying a bit more direction, let's say. When you have clear goals and feedback, it becomes much easier to see what's missing. For example, noticing that you struggle with certain verb conjugations, messing up your word order, if you learn Japanese, or lacking vocabulary in specific topics. Once you can clearly identify your weaknesses, they are a lot easier to tackle. Alright, so that is all I have for you today. This video was a little bit shorter because I was running behind on my uploading schedule, and in 2026 I'm really trying hard to be consistent on YouTube. That's going to be the fourth video uploaded weekly in a row, and I want to be consistent, just like I want to be consistent with my Japanese, and it doesn't always have to be perfect or exactly how you want it, so this video is a little bit shorter for that reason. But I think that's not to make this outro long, but I think life is also about not always being perfect, but showing up. And I want to manifest that for me this year. Here we go. And if you've watched this video until the end, including my rant in the outro, I would like you to drop your favorite food as an emoji. Here we go. All right, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.